Do the English tell the same old jokes? Of course they do. We see this in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they use the joke of the killer rabbit. And this exists in manuscript after manuscript in the Middle Ages. And this is a joke which turns the world upside down. You take a conventional pursuit, which is a necessary pursuit, which is hunting, in which you have, hounds coursing or chasing a rabbit, and you invert that, the rabbit hunting the humans. Hi, I'm Dr. James Wade. I'm a specialist in medieval literature, medieval manuscripts, and folklore. Well, nowadays we're used to laughing at authority and making fun of those in power. And in the Middle Ages, they were equally used to making fun of people in authority, but so little of that survives. And so when we have an opportunity to see in a manuscript a survival of an oral performance that does that same kind of work and makes those same kinds of jokes, it's rare and valuable. For example, we have a rare snippet of a drinking song. For God loves neither horse nor mare, but merry men that in the cup can stare. And this is a great example of a long-standing idea that there are two things that make all humans equal. One is death, and the other is drunkenness. We also have in this manuscript the earliest example of the use of a red herring as a diversion. The joke at the heart of this use of red herring is that kings are diversions. And so we find Cyrus he read that there was once a king, and he made a great feast, and 3 kings at this feast, and these kings ate but one gruel dish. And they ate so much that their bellies burst, and out of their bellies came 24 oxen, and these oxen played at the sword and buckler, and there were left no more on leave but 3 red herrings. And this is the earliest reference to the idea of a red herring as a diversion. And the diversion is very simply, the performance of kings at feasts, and their gluttony and their excessive drinking lead to excess and diversion. One strategy for writing edgy poetry in the Middle Ages is to use nonsense, because it creates this distance from reality and this sort of deniability through the absurdity of the language and the images. And one example of this is the Battle of Brackenwet, an alliterative nonsense verse that was performed by this minstrel. And it goes like this. At the Battle of Brackenwet, there as the bear jousted, Sam Sawyer and the Slunkat there were sworn brother. The hare and hearthstone birtled together, while the humblebee hood was hacked all to clotus. There Shamal the sheldrake and sheep trumpet. Hog with his hornpipe hoed him believer, and danced on the dunghill while all the day lasted. With Mago and Marjorie, and Malin her sister, the priest into the place priest for to winna. Keen men of Cumber, common believer, for to mot of much what, more than a little, how Reynell and Robin Hood running at the Glover. One of the great things about having a witness of minstrel texts is that it gives us access to medieval life lived fully and in its flourishing. We know that minstrels traveled, and they worked from the baronial hall to the tavern, to the pub, to the alehouse, to the village fair. And so they would have seen all of medieval life, and they would have brought this into the material that they performed. And so what we see in minstrel texts is an absurdist image of medieval life lived fully. He or she would have a day job as a plowman, as a peddler, involved in some craft, who would, on the evenings or at the weekend, go gigging. So much of live performance, even today, is at that semi-professional level, where people are performing at weekends and at nights, and performing in their local area. And so what we see today is really a snapshot of what we would see in the 15th century, or to turn that around, what we see in the 15th century anticipates what is happening still today. there is so little evidence of live performance and oral culture in the Middle Ages. Most scribes in the Middle Ages, assume that they are anonymous. They are simply mediums for the transmission of texts that are copied and then recopied by them. And what we find in Richard Heage is something different. We find, first of all, a scribe who is prepared to expose or display some of their character, but also a scribe who's interested not just in pre-recorded texts, but in live entertainment. And so this is what makes Heage so special. He's a witness. He is a medium, not just for pre-recorded text, but for live performance. The Heage manuscript looks like most other 15th century miscellany manuscripts, in that there is no sort of obvious physical clues to the sources of its text. But one of the most interesting sort of moments for me in looking through the manuscript was when I saw a colophon, which is the kind of the signing off signature of the scribe, in which Richard Heage says, par me, by me, Richard Heage, who was at that feast and did not have a drink. And I thought this was an extraordinary display of character, of humor, comedy, by a scribe who is meant to be anonymous, but sort of lets some of his sort of sense of ironic humor slip into the page.